Welcome to our Indigenous Allyship Research Series. In this series, we will review the results of 3 studies conducted by the Indigenous Organizations and Communities Research Development Lab. These modules were made possible with funding through Atapito, the University of Calgary's Indigenous Strategy, and its Office of Indigenous Engagement. In our previous module, Module 1, we described the significance of allyship in the context of reconciliation and showed how non-Indigenous people cluster around supportive, anxious, and cavalier orientations towards solidarity with Indigenous peoples. Further, we showed that some people claim the title ally to Indigenous peoples, even when their beliefs seem contrary to the claim. While Study 1 helps us to understand the ways that non-Indigenous peoples use the word ally in conjunction with sometimes opposing ideas, attitudes, intentions, and values about solidarity with Indigenous peoples, it did not provide advice to my students' deceptively simple question: how can I be a good ally to Indigenous peoples? In this module, Module 2, we discuss what allyship looks like from an Indigenous perspective. The design of Study 2 was simple. When Indigenous students signed up for our study, we invited them to an interview instead of the Q methodology study described in Module 1. We asked 2 overarching questions. What are your experiences with non-Indigenous peoples acting on behalf of or in support of Indigenous peoples? And what defines an ally? Indigenous students described a range of experiences with non-Indigenous peoples acting in support of or on behalf of Indigenous peoples. Stories were told about friends, romantic partners, family and adopted family, fellow students, co-workers, bosses, business owners, coaches, and strangers. Their stories told of ways that people can act that are either congruent or incongruent with their expectations of an ally. Using the inductive version of Braun and Clark's thematic analysis, we coded for actions associated with being a good ally or being a not so good ally. We then grouped those actions according to higher order themes based on their similarity. Interestingly, the not so good allies, which I would like to call nallies, were associated with behaviors that involved positive intentions or positive actions, but they were enacted in a way that contorted or diminished their intended effect. We had 8 codes of this kind. We named or borrowed catchy titles to help communicate the ideas. The first is the savior syndrome, when supposed allies perceive themselves as saviors who hold a higher moral position or worth than non-allies, or even the people they pretend to save. The appropriator, whose form of allyship involves self-interested motives, such as learning about Indigenous cultures or partnering on Indigenous issues for professional gain, credibility, or prestige only. The voice stealer, who purports to represent Indigenous peoples, sometimes substitutes for more inclusive practices. The cherry picker, those are allies whose allyship depends on commercially marketable forms of indigeneity rather than on need. The blind donator, who throws money at issues or signs petitions without attempting to understand the factors at play. The roadblock, or purporting to help without creating opportunity or being open to learn, listen to others, or suspend judgment. The I have an Indian friend ally, where allyship is assumed because one has an Indigenous friend or family member. And the fair weather friend, when individuals only ally when it's popular or convenient. When Indigenous students described positive allyship experiences, examples were numerous. We had 26 codes, which we saw reflecting 4 broader themes. The themes were taking action, disposition and self-worth, shared understandings, and relationships. Taking action was ally-like behaviors, including asking and seeking info from Indigenous people, leveraging their power on behalf of Indigenous interests, taking risks, making space, desiring change, participating in activism, empowering Indigenous voices, and prioritizing community and collective interests over individual or self-interests. The second, the disposition and self-worth, these behaviors involve things like patience, openness, humility, compassion, authenticity, integrity, long-term commitment, willingness to continue growing, ability to be vulnerable, open to criticism, appreciation, and positive intentions. The third theme on shared understandings included descriptions of non-Indigenous individuals empathizing with Indigenous perspectives because they learned together, lived similar experiences, held shared beliefs, values, goals, and attempted to learn about the histories of Indigenous people and colonization. The fourth theme was about relationships. Although the codes in this theme were few, they came up often. Non-Indigenous people were described as allies when they treated Indigenous people with value, showing respect, investing in the relationships, and demonstrating reciprocity. It is important to note here that these allyship domains appear to be mutually dependent. That is, they need each other for allyship to be fulfilled. While each quadrant in the circle is pretty good in and of itself, allyship is best achieved when all four domains are present. Their interdependence is visible when our not-so-good allyship codes are grouped within their related allyship themes. Within 3 of the 4 quadrants, there is a bad way to do a good thing, or at least in a way that is not perceived of as allyship, that is corrected for if the other domains are fulfilled. For example, if someone regularly takes action without shared understandings of Indigenous experiences, they are vulnerable to fall into the blind donator syndrome. Without relationships to Indigenous people, perhaps the voice stealer. Without the right disposition, perhaps the cherry picker form of allyship that we described earlier. Similarly, someone might have shared understandings, but without relationships or the right disposition or the action, they may be better called a neighbor or a scholar or a member of another marginalized minority, but not an ally. Shared understandings alone are vulnerable to becoming an appropriator or serving as a roadblock if they assume knowledge of the other incorrectly. If a person has relationships alone, without shared understandings, action, or right disposition, perhaps that person is a family member, or a friend, or an acquaintance, but again, not an ally. Those individuals are vulnerable to the pitfalls of the I have an Indian friend syndrome, fair weather friend, and savior syndrome forms of allyship. Finally, if someone has integrity and compassion and warm disposition, they might be a kind and empathetic person, but without action, shared understandings, and relationships, ally is not the appropriate label. This study showed that the term ally represents a complex concept from Indigenous points of view, where political, spiritual, cognitive, and relational elements combine and balance each other out. Importantly, we helped move the conversation beyond the simplistic binary of whether someone is an ally or not, and instead present a more developmental model of allyship, where growth in one area, such as activism, does not necessarily co-occur with growth in another area, such as self-work. Similarly, that good intentions can go awry if they are not grounded by holistic commitments. We believe this formulation better reflects our complicated reality, recognizes the efforts, relationships, self-work, and shared understandings of those who are not yet allies, and provides a template for those who strive to be well-rounded allies. While our results do not justify one's self-identification as an ally, they do show that non-Indigenous allies exist in the minds of young Indigenous adults, and that the term is associated with certain attributes, dispositions, and behaviors. We offer this framework for your consideration. If you are deciding if you want to pursue allyship, or if you've already committed but need direction, or you've asked yourself, how can I be an ally to Indigenous peoples? Results from these studies were presented to Reg and Rose Crowshoe and Michal Hart at a pipe ceremony in Smudge on December 10th, 2021 at the University of Calgary's Office of Indigenous Engagement. For more information about non-Indigenous orientations towards allyship with Indigenous peoples, see Module 1 in this series. For what Indigenous faculty members are looking for in job applicants, please check out our 3rd module. Special thanks to Elena Baliga and Miranda Harborn for their diligent work on these projects, and Hanit Kang and Max Moore for their work on these videos. For more information about our work, check out our website or email me. Acheya.